This scene pretty much confirms that the God's Knights are not the main villains of Elbaf, but simply an appetizer before the true villain is revealed. This has been pretty evident for a lot of chapters now, as the God's Knights have now several times said that they are afraid of Luffy and don't want to mess with him. Scopper Gaban should be a much weaker character than Luffy, as Gaban all but admitted that he was personally even weaker than Loki, yet Sommers is still horrified upon seeing him. This unavoidably made me think back to the scene in Sabaody, when Rayleigh attacked Kizaru. Even though he was facing Roger's right hand, Kizaru was still calm and collected, and was merely annoyed that Rayleigh was making his mission more difficult than it needed to be. Sommers' reaction, meanwhile, is an expression worthy of an L, and is something the story only ever shows when a character has met someone they cannot beat. Gaban being much stronger than the God's Knights is not a particularly crazy idea. The Knights are strong, but this chapter showed just how much they rely on their immortality, where Robin did genuinely overpower Sommers at many points during their fight, but the problem always ended up being that she couldn't actually damage him. Gaban in this chapter seemingly confirms what we already saw on Egghead, which is that Conqueror's Haki can actually bypass the Celestial Dragon's special abilities. It's starting to look more and more like the Knights are maybe only around as strong as the middling Straw Hats, and that they only appear stronger due to their immortality. If they were actually up against a Conqueror's Haki user like Zoro, let alone a monster like Luffy, the Knights would more than likely just get walked over. If the Knights are not in fact a good challenge for Luffy, it does however present a huge problem for the Elbaf arc. Basically, we clearly need another main villain. We're currently over 20 chapters deep into the arc, so the idea of the arc main villain not having been introduced yet may be odd, but it's not impossible. For a small example, it took almost 40 chapters for Whole Cake Island to finally introduce Katakuri. Introducing really strong enemies deep into the arc is also something that just happened in Egghead, when the rest of the elders came down on the island over 50 chapters into the arc. I also think that the chances of Elbaf being a smaller arc, where Luffy doesn't get a big fight, are also extremely low at this point. There have now been several ominous scenes that hint that something huge will happen in Elbaf, and that the island is going to face a threat far bigger than just the God's Knights. Since Elbaf was first mentioned in Little Garden, it has always been set up as this fabled land of war in the One Piece world, so Luffy leaving this island without having had at least one huge fight, to me is just incredibly unlikely, considering the pace Elbaf is going at, and all the hanging plot threads. This is also clearly going to be a long arc, which only makes it more likely that Luffy will face some huge threat on this island. At least the way I see it, everything is pointing to Luffy having his next Yonko caliber fight on Elbaf, and the real question is not if it will happen, but instead who Luffy will fight. So, let me try to actually tackle this question. Who could this big Elbaf enemy be if the God's Knights are not strong enough? I'd definitely like to hear the opinion of anyone watching this video, but honestly, I still think it's pretty obviously going to be Big Mom. I could make an hour-long video covering all the evidence why, whether you like it or not, this is basically guaranteed to happen. But I'd actually rather talk about something else in this video. Are there any solid options for Elbaf's main villain other than Big Mom? To begin with, I genuinely feel like basically every world government character is disqualified from the conversation of Elbaf's main villain. This might sound surprising, since they are currently the villains of the arc, but even more importantly, it could actually be really easy for the story to introduce a stronger villain like this, since the God's Knights can seemingly summon almost any government character to Elbaf via the magic circle. This is however exactly the problem. The reason why I don't think anyone from the government can serve as the arc villain is exactly because of the magic circle. Even if the God's Knights did something crazy like summon Garling to Elbaf, they would be incredibly weakened for having traveled to the island through the magic circle. We already saw on Egghead that summoned characters can be sent back without them being fully beaten. When Luffy blasted Saint Mars off the island, he seemingly teleported right back to the Holy Land. And this same thing happened with the other elders, when Emmet used Soy Boy's Conqueror's Haki on them. Based on this, even if Imu himself came to Elbaf, he could be sent right back if Luffy just punted him far enough from the island, or used strong enough Conqueror's Haki. While this could still make for a decent fight for Luffy, with all of his past big fights, the story has always put Luffy in a position where he's only considered the winner. only after he's knocked the lights off his opponent. Because Luffy would have a huge advantage over anyone who came to Elbaf through the magic circle, I genuinely think the story will use someone else as Luffy's next big opponent. I think it's really anyone's guess who the main arc villain could be. I personally think any of the other Yonko showing up on Elbaf isn't particularly likely. We still don't know where Shanks is currently heading, but we know it's anywhere but Elbaf. Blackbeard doesn't have much of a reason to fight the Straw Hats, as he already has all of the same road poneglyph rubbings as Luffy, and he even has his own potential translator in Pudding. And honestly, Blackbeard's subplot is seemingly heading in a completely different direction, where he can now possibly go after 2 ancient weapons, and the final saga has already set up a ton of material for his own involvement with the world government. Compared to Shanks and Teach, there's actually not much stopping Buggy from going to Elbaf. Mihawk said that he didn't want to challenge Luffy, but he's for now seemingly been outruled in the Cross Guild by Buggy's charisma. However, I personally kind of hope that Buggy realizes that he's got a much smarter play available to him in getting the poneglyph rubbings than going after Luffy. Buggy literally traveled with Ronja, which means that he already knows where most of the road poneglyphs are. This could even solve the problem of him currently not having a way of reading the ancient language, since he on paper could do something like kidnap Sukiyaki to be his translator if he went to get Wano's stone. If you're interested, you should click here to watch my full breakdown of why Buggy going to Wano would make all the sense in the world, and how this plot could play out. I do not however think the Cross Guild going to Elbaf is that bad of an idea either, but it still wouldn't be the answer to the big question of this video, which is Luffy getting his big arc opponent. The only one in the Cross Guild who could give Luffy this kind of a fight is honestly Mihawk. But even though they fought at Marineford, the idea of Luffy getting a full fight with Mihawk before Zoro is basically impossible in my eyes. If the Yonko and the government are out of the picture, there is still however one big option left, which is that Luffy's big Elbaf arc villain is already on the island. For the record, I'm not talking about Kid, even though he's probably still somewhere on the island too. Instead, I think the big Chekhov's gun left in this arc is Heaven World. Even though we are 24 chapters into Elbaf, we still know literally nothing about a whole 1/3 of this island. If previous arcs tell us anything, this last hidden area has in the past often been where we found some really strong characters. Last year, I did a theory that never made it into a video, speculating that there could actually be a second kingdom of giants on Elbaf. To this day, it is simply very strange that this island is called Elbaf, but the Giants' country instead has a different name called Warland. This is incredibly unusual for One Piece, where the country and the island almost always bear the same name. I think this could be set up for there being a second, even more powerful kingdom of giants, possibly located in this Heaven World. At least so far, for the fabled Land of Warriors, the giants of the Sun World have not been particularly impressive, but this could be genuine bait, where the true strongest giants all live in this mythical highest level of the island. Luffy having a big fight against a giant in the future seems fairly likely at this point, since the manga has put so much emphasis on Gear 5 turning Luffy big. It would be natural for this giant versus giant fight to happen on Elbaf, particularly since there is so much focus on Nika being a mythological figure on this island. If you want one final curveball idea, there is still the NL theory, where we did hear about an entire village in the Sun World being recently destroyed by lightning, which would 100% be an NL move. It's not much evidence, but we honestly don't get much more than this in One Piece before a character is revealed. Even with Kaban, all the evidence that he was on Elbaf was still only a few loose pieces, yet here we are. I don't actually think NL being on this island would even be that crazy, where he'd only be doing what he learned the ancients did on the moon, going down on the blue planet to get resources. By the way, it was very recently confirmed that the blue planet is literally the canonical name of the One Piece planet, though I'm still not used to calling it that. Even if NL somehow were on Elbaf, I do not however think he could be Luffy's big opponent. Luffy will always basically be NL's nightmare matchup because he's made of rubber, and no amount of Haki or Devil Fruit awakenings can really change that. We also already saw this kind of dynamic play out in the last arc with Luffy vs Lucci, where no matter how strong these pre-time skip enemies have gotten, Luffy has simply become someone out of their reach. I could still go over even crazier options, like Sebek somehow coming back, or some Void Century characters traveling to present-day Elbaf through time, but my only real idea here is that whoever the villain is, Elbaf is likely going to be facing some existential threat in this arc. How I think this arc will play out is that this incident with the God's Knights was pretty much a wake-up call for the Giants. Essentially, I think the Giants will realize that while it is completely fine for them to study and to trade with the world, this does not mean that they shouldn't be able to defend themselves. The God's Knights are practically hammering this message home, where they're not just attacking the Giants, but they literally want to enslave them and to destroy their culture. And if this wasn't wild enough, they've also decided to do this by targeting the country's children. We've also now seen that most of the Giants are not just willing to submit to these invaders' demands, but almost all of them instead chose to take up arms. What I think the purpose of all of this is that later in the arc, there is going to be a much bigger threat coming to this island, and after their escapade with the God's Knights, both the Giants and the Straw Hats will realize that they need to prepare Elbaf for war. I also think this is the kind of story Oda has wanted to tell for a long time. One of Oda's top 3 favorite movies is an older Japanese film called Seven Samurai. Many of you probably know it, but if you don't, the movie is about a rural Japanese village getting frequently raided by bandits. The villagers then finally decide that they have had enough, and they plan to drive off the bandits by hiring a few samurai. Most of the movie is focused on the samurai and the villagers together preparing for the next bandit raid, and the movie ends in a climactic battle, where they fight together to defeat the bandits. Even though Oda loves this movie, the usual spin One Piece gives to this kind of storyline is that the Straw Hats have to overthrow evil people who are already on the island. The way things are going, Elbaf could possibly finally tell this story in its original form, where the Straw Hats and the Giants together have to prepare for a big invasion, or a Big Mom invasion. That's at least my current idea on how this arc could play out. I'm not honestly much of a predictor, and I'm more keen on just talking about story ideas I find interesting. Even though Saint Sommers looked horrified when facing Gaban, I think he actually showed a lot of impressive stuff in his fight against Robin. When he at the end immobilizes Robin, that isn't some gimmicky celestial dragon ability, but pure devil fruit might. Based on the previous chapters, this is clearly the God's Knights' forte, where they're all extremely skilled devil fruit users. This fight also showed Sommers being able to seemingly turn his body into thorns, which is actually really abnormal among Paramecia fruit users, who most of the time can just conjure their fruit's element. If you're interested, you can click here to watch my other video where I went over this, and how both Kunko and Sommers could be special Paramecia users like Katakuri, which I think is an idea this chapter made hell of a lot more likely. This chapter also brought up another thing I mentioned in that video, which was the range of devil fruit powers, where Robin's plan was to get Sommers far enough out of range for his abilities to no longer work. This might have technically been a good plan, but Sommers' range based on previous chapters is actually huge, so I think he might have had to fall all the way down to the underworld for his thorns to no longer work on the Kitch. It's a really cool moment for Robin though, where it's a rare case of a One Piece character using strategy. And I'm not sure if we've ever had an action scene like this before in the story. While it may be overpowered, I suppose the God's Knights being immortal does add an interesting layer of strategy to the combat, considering the way the page that had Jarl commanding Ange to burn down the library emphasized Biblo the Owl. I could see him showing his true colors and stopping her. There's something very strange going on with this owl, since it has apparently been the guardian of the library for centuries beyond counting. Yet, it has also eaten the Crow fruit, so we know it can't just be a giant disguised as a Zoan. The only explanation I can come up with is that a previous user of the Ope Ope no Mi had the bright idea of giving eternal life to an owl, but other than that, I really have no idea how this thing is still alive. Even though she's the titular character of this chapter, I don't have much to say about Ronja. I think her speech is definitely setting up Elbaf regaining its national spirit later in the arc, but for now, it's pretty understandable that she basically broke Jarl's heart and made him obey the knights. I could actually see the story doing some baiting with her in the next chapter, where she could actually end up falling off the branch, but would then be rescued by either Luffy or Sanji, since both of them can literally fly. If Sommers is already scared seeing a bond, just imagine what his face will look like once the monster trio shows up. For the cover story, I still think Kiku will soon be revealed as the daimyo of Hakumai once Yamato gets there, but I have to say, Yamato wearing a straw hat is not exactly a fashion choice I endorse. However, it very interestingly does make Yamato one of the candidates to destroy Fishman Island in the future. I'm still, however, personally betting on Fishman Island's destroyer actually being Mihawk. Thank you to all me members, but if you also want to support me channel, click the join button and you'll get yourself my members only content. Appreciate everyone who watched this video to the end.